So we're going to look at how the Reformation as a religious and political movement shifts and expands, moving beyond just Martin Luther in the Holy Roman Empire to include Switzerland with Zwingli and Calvin, the Dutch area with the Anabaptists, and then up to England with the English Reformation. So we're going to kind of look a little bit at how this Reformation really expands. And first we need to have a kind of a better understanding of the area we're looking at. So this is the map that shows the possessions of Charles V in 1526, when he completes his inheritance of all of the Habsburg land. So he controls most of the Iberian Peninsula, that is Spain. He controls the Kingdom of Naples in Sicily, also these two islands of Sardinia, Corsica, and Genoa. And then he is named the Holy Roman Emperor as well. And we need to have an understanding of the Holy Roman Empire here, is that it's not necessarily a cohesive identity. Within the Holy Roman Empire, there's anywhere, or somewhere around 300 different principalities. And there are a number of people who get together to elect the Holy Roman Empire. And they, of course, always elect the Habsburg family because they do control a large chunk of the Holy Roman Empire at this time. And so Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor. He directly controls the lands here that are in yellow, as well as Spain. And then you got to remember 1526. So we're also talking about Spanish holdings overseas, which are pretty significant at this time in the Americas. Remember, Columbus has sailed. They've got parts of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean at this point. So Charles V has a massive empire, really, truly huge. So that's kind of the world in which we are dealing with in this Reformation. And Charles V, again, he's a Habsburg member. He rules these areas, and his whole goal is to preserve the unity of the Catholic Church. One of the main ways that Spain was able to unify and kind of develop into a modern nation is through this like everyone having the same Catholic identity. And so Charles wants to keep that throughout Europe. So everything he does in the Holy Roman Empire is really geared towards Catholic unity and squashing the Protestant uprisings. And he's got kind of two major enemies. First is the Valois, and the Habsburg-Valois wars will go on seemingly forever, for a very long time. And so Francis I is the one that Charles V is having to deal with here. The Habsburg-Valois wars occur from 1521 to 1544. It's the same time that there's essentially civil war in the Holy Roman Empire because of Martin Luther. But this rivalry between the Valois and Habsburg family goes on much further than that. And so you see that France is threatening the Habsburg lands. It's threatening the Holy Roman Empire from the west, and it's threatening Spain from the north. And the other enemy that he has to worry about is the Ottoman Empire, which we see right here, that is controlling not just all of southeastern Europe and Turkey and the Middle East, but also North Africa, a really massive powerhouse. And they're under the leadership of Suleiman the Magnificent, who is one of the greatest leaders of all time, and certainly one of the most important Ottoman leaders of all time. And so he is expanding his north and west. His goal is to bring Islam into Europe, and of course Charles is trying to stop that. And Charles eventually is able to, so Suleiman wins at what's known as the Battle of Mohacs, and that is when Turkey kind of takes over most of Hungary and threatens Vienna. There is a siege of Vienna moment where the Turks are turned back and never really again threatened. But we have to understand that Charles, in addition to dealing with Luther and noble uprisings in his own empire, is facing threats from the Ottomans and from the French. So things are difficult and very stressful for Charles V. And so we see that there's a very kind of continuation of religious wars that we'll deal with a little bit later. There's something known as the Diet of Augsburg, and that's where Luther gets together with Melanchthon to kind of have the statement on the fundamental beliefs of the Lutheran Church. And out of this we see the rise of the Schmalkaldic League, which is a defensive alliance, an agreement between princes who choose to convert to Lutheranism. They agree that they will, if one of them is attacked, they will all defend themselves against the aggressor. And so that's happening. At the same time that's happening, war breaks out against the Turks again. Again, this is that Battle of Vienna. Then Charles V engages himself in the Schmalkaldic Wars in 1546. Initially, the Battle of Mulberg is fought, and Catholics win that, and it looks like they may be able to suppress these Lutheran princes in the Holy Roman Empire. This is essentially a Holy Roman Empire civil war until France hops in on the side of the Schmalkaldic League in order to, again, Henry II of France, the king, his goal is to weaken the power of the Holy Roman Empire. So he succeeds in doing that. Eventually, all of this chaos, which we're talking 25 years of war after Martin Luther, is initially settled with what's known as the Peace of Augsburg. And the Peace of Augsburg exists in the Holy Roman Empire. And under the Peace of Augsburg, Lutherans get the same legal rights as Catholics. So they are acknowledged as being at least having equal protection, if not being equal. And the phrase that we should know here is he who rules his religion. So every German prince gets then the choice as to whether they want to be Lutheran or Catholic. And the other German princes respect that and won't affect that change. And then the people who live in there just follow that religion because that's what the German prince says. And when there are over 300 of these different principalities, that kind of settles this infighting that had been existing for a long while. Of course, this takes away a lot of the power of the Holy Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Emperor, because he just really lacks any teeth if he can't force everyone to follow the same religion. So that's a little bit about the religious wars, and we'll certainly have to dive a lot more into those later, but that gives us an overview for what's happening in the midst of these reformations. There's a lot of turmoil. So, Lutheranism spreads beyond the Holy Roman Empire and really spreads into Scandinavia, where it takes root very much so in Sweden and Denmark. Gustavus Vasa in Sweden is the king, and he's the one who kind of makes that the religion of Sweden. And then Frederick I of Denmark makes that the religion of Denmark as well. And so we'll see eventually that all these Lutheran nations will team up against the Holy Roman Empire in later religious wars. And those religious wars don't go away for a while. In addition to this, there is Reformation in Switzerland. And the first of this is led by a man by the name of Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich, Switzerland. And Zwingli kind of tries to create this league of evangelical cities. So he tries to build a theocracy. And that is a world or a country in where the religious leaders are the same as the civil leaders. And so he gets these groups of cities in Switzerland to kind of abide by his following. And of course, Switzerland is part of the Holy Roman Empire at this point. And Zwingli is really impressed by Luther and follows a lot of his teachings, although has some different ones. And so Zwingli wants to meet with Luther, and they do at what's known as the Marburg Colloquy in 1529. They cannot agree on the nature of communion, and so they leave while Zwingli doesn't convert to Lutheranism, or there's not this unification of these two religions. And so Zwingli and Luther leave from Marburg and fail to meet. Eventually the Catholics attack Zwingli's little collection of cities, and in this battle Ulrich Zwingli is killed, bringing an end to what we can kind of term as Zwingliism, which never really gains much momentum. The people in Zurich didn't really like him much towards the end, so they were more than happy to turn on him and watch him die in battle in order to save their own skin. So that's Zwingli. And he's moderately important, but not nearly as important as John Calvin. And John Calvin comes along as a French-educated lawyer, and he's working out of Geneva, Switzerland, and he writes a pamphlet or a treatise known as the Institutes of the Christian Religion. And in this, he argues for the concept of predestination, and this is the crux of Calvinism. Calvin argues that God has pre-selected those who will get into heaven. And they are predestined to get into heaven or not, that your destination is already chosen. It really kind of eliminates the concept of free will, and it predetermines whether you are going to heaven or not. And the people who are going to heaven, John Calvin calls the elect. So predestination is the crux of his religion. He also gets rid of most of the sacraments, keeping only baptism and communion, just like Luther. He too sets up a theocracy in Geneva, and he writes these ecclesiastical ordinances in 1541, which says that the rulers of the city have to be also the rulers of the church. And so what ends up happening is we see the rise of what's known as the consistory, which is the governing body of a local church. So your local church would select kind of this council of elders. They would sort of be appointed to be on this council, and there they would rule the local church and by extension the local city, in order to kind of have this melding of church and state. So we can see here the three kind of major religions that we're dealing with here: Catholicism, Lutheranism, and Calvinism. And the biggest change is up here in this section, this salvation. Catholics believe salvation is achieved through faith and good works. Luther argues through faith alone, and Calvin says God alone predetermined. So that's crucial. And then you see head of the church in Catholicism is Pope. Lutherans and Calvinists reject the authority of the Pope. Lutherans elect their councils. Calvinist has council of elders, so people who are appointed. Luther and Calvin both think that the Bible is the only source of truth, and people should be able to read and interpret it themselves. So really the big difference between Luther and Calvin is this idea of predestination versus sola fides, and that is faith through salvation through faith. So those are kind of looking at the three major religious reforms. And then in this atmosphere of reform comes another group called the Anabaptists. And Anabaptists view the church as kind of a body of believers and really emphasize the concept of democracy. And I really want to take a minute to make sure that we understand how outrageous that is in the 1500s, that someone is pushing for the concept of democracy, some belief that will not take root until the late 1700s in the United States. But the fact that someone in the 1500s is pushing for democracy is really revolutionary and radical. Anabaptists believe in adult baptism. So the other three religions we just looked at baptize people as children. And the Anabaptists argue that you should be making a free choice when you are baptized. You should be accepting your faith. Therefore, you should be baptized as an adult. So there's that. Another radical element to the Anabaptists, and they really are really an out there branch at this moment, is that they believe that women can preach. And so you see beginnings of gender equality. So again, in the 1500s, you have a group that's not only pushing for democracy, but also for gender equality. And this is flying directly in the face of absolute monarchy and women as being viewed as subservient and in lesser roles. So the Anabaptists are kind of on the fringes of society. They view communion, or what's known as the Lord's Supper, as remembrance only. It's done in spiritual kind of remembrance. It doesn't have transubstantiation like Catholicism or consubstantiation like Lutheranism. They think it's only a remembrance. And these Anabaptists, they refuse to hold political office, and they refuse to fight. They really believe the commandment of thou shalt not kill, and so they don't fight, and they don't believe that there should be any need for them to be involved in politics. They want to be removed from the worldly affairs in order to focus on their spirituality. This, of course, makes them the favorite target of everybody, because if they're refusing to fight back, everybody can go kill them, and it's nice and easy. You can kill them, take their stuff, and not have to worry about any repercussions. So the Anabaptists get targeted fairly often. This movement kind of begins in Munster in the 1530s with a guy by the name of John of Leyden, and then springing from this group is another group known as the Mennonites, created by Menno Simons, and he really emphasizes this separation from the world. The Mennonites are the same or similar groups as they live in the Pennsylvania Dutch region of the United States. The Amish people follow similar to Mennonite teaching. They're slightly different, but same idea going on there. So this Anabaptist, although they are radical reformers, they do still exist to this day, and they do exert some influence. So in the middle of all of this religious reforms comes what really begins as a political reformation and then slowly becomes religious. And that is the English Reformation. So the background to this is that Henry VIII, the King of England, is married to Catherine of Aragon from Spain. And he wants to get a divorce from her because Catherine is not providing him a male heir. And so he's asking for an annulment of their marriage, which they didn't have divorce at the time. So an annulment would have invalidated their marriage. And so in order for an annulment to happen, Henry VIII needs to have the Pope approve of this annulment. So he asks for an annulment from the Pope. The problem is, at the time he announces this or asks for this annulment, the Pope has just seen his lands invaded by Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who also happens to be related to this Catherine of Aragon that Henry VIII is married to. So Charles isn't too keen on letting his relative have this annulment happen. And so he tells the Pope basically, yeah, you're not going to grant that. We're not going to let that happen. So the Pope turns down Henry VIII's wish for an annulment. And so because of this, Henry just decides, kind of, forget this. I'm just going to make my own church. And so he creates the Church of England, and he exerts his own supremacy over it. He makes himself the head of the Church of England. Again, at first, this is a political reformation. He doesn't change, initially, any of the worship. He doesn't change any of the structure. The only thing he changes is who is the head of the church. Instead of the Pope being the head of the church, he's now the head of the church. And he just makes everyone who is in every religious person, every clergy member, just swear a new oath of allegiance that acknowledges that the king is in fact the head of the church. It is this order that Sir Thomas More, that we talked about in the past, ignores, that gets his head cut off. So this is Henry VIII. And of course, Henry VIII is best known for his 6 wives. He cannot be happy with just one. And his first wife is Catherine of Aragon. And Catherine, in fact, does have a child with him. And that is, Catherine actually has 6 children. But they all either die in infancy or are stillborn. Except the only one that survives is Mary. Mary the First, who we will come back to as Bloody Mary, not too much further from now. So we will come back to Bloody Mary in a little bit. But Mary is born to King Henry. And so Mary is raised Catholic. He then marries Anne Boleyn, and she has another daughter with King Henry. That is Elizabeth the First. And Henry finds that Anne is having an affair, so he simply has her head cut off. And so we have Catherine gets Henry divorces, beheads, and then he marries Jane Seymour, who has finally his son and heir, Edward VI. The problem is that Edward is a weak and sick child who will not last very long, as we'll see in a minute. That is a spoiler. Jane Seymour dies in childbirth, and so Henry remarries Anne of Cleves, and he ends up divorcing Anne of Cleves in order to marry Catherine Howard. And then he cuts Catherine Howard's head off in order to marry Catherine Parr. So if you want to remember how the 6 wives of Henry VIII, it's divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Because after his marriage to Catherine Parr, Henry VIII himself passes away. So this is Henry and his 6 wives, the famous image of it. So this English Reformation continues, and we're going to jump back real quickly. But this Act of Supremacy is issued by King Henry VIII, and the Act of Supremacy makes the King of England the head of the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, and any heirs to the throne to be also the heirs to the head of the Anglican Church. So it kind of solidifies the ruler of England as also being the leader of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. After Henry VIII dies, his son Edward VI comes. And Edward VI, under him, we start to see the Anglican Church really kind of shift away from the Catholic Church and become more of its own independent entity. And one of the ways that's done is with the Book of Common Prayer, which is kind of the order of worship that is created. And that starts to look a little bit different from the Catholic one. And it's also written in English, which recognizes, again, a shift, as all the Catholics' worship was done in Latin. So we start to see that Edward moves it away from Rome. There is a succession crisis when Edward VI dies, because Edward does not leave any children. So Mary I, as the daughter of Henry, as the firstborn daughter, believes that she has a right to the throne. At this point, and we'll talk a lot more about this at a later date, but at this point, Mary is married to Philip II, the King of Spain. And of course, Spain is this bastion of Catholic virtue. And so Philip and Mary decide that they want to reconvert England back to Catholicism. And it is during this demand for everyone to become Catholic again that Mary executes hundreds, if not thousands, of people in what is known as, well, there are a series of purges, and it earns her the nickname Bloody Mary for all of this blood that is on her hands. So she executed all these hundreds for heresy. And those who don't get executed often leave. They go through what's known as self-imposed exile. So they leave England for fear of their life to go live elsewhere, and a large group of them goes to live in Geneva. Eventually, this group will come back when Mary dies, and that group is known as the Puritans. And those Puritans are the same people who sail over to the United States on the Mayflower, land at Plymouth Rock, and set up the first American colonies. So that's a story for a different day. When Bloody Mary dies, or is removed from office, her sister, Elizabeth I, takes over. Elizabeth I tries to follow what's known as the Via Media, which is the middle ground, where she's not going to be as harsh as Mary or Edward in terms of persecuting people of the other religions. She wants to find kind of common grounds to allow both Protestants and Catholics to worship and enjoy and live peacefully in England. This does not sit well with Philip II, who is still King of Spain, but because Mary is no longer Queen of England, no longer has title to the throne of England. So he launches what's known as the Spanish Armada in 1588. This is a massive fleet of naval warships in order to kind of re-Catholicize England and to remove the Protestant scourge from Europe. That is his goal, is to make Europe all Catholic again. The Spanish Armada is defeated thanks to some really bad weather, but as well there's some good naval command from the English. And this bad weather is sometimes called the Protestant wind because it helps defeat a large number of these Catholic Spanish ships as it goes. So England kind of, the way to think of it is as a pendulum. It swings from Anglican very strongly back to Catholicism, and then Elizabeth tries to follow a middle ground known as the Via Media, where everyone can just get along. And that is kind of a really quick look at what the Reformation looks like as it moves and progresses away from Martin Luther.